Welcome. It's the Matt Sager podcast for Wednesday, February 19th, 2019. And as I mentioned yesterday, in what has been the first episode of this podcast in way too long, there's a lot going on, perhaps really the most important on my agenda. It's coming up real soon, Better Call Saul Season 5. It's making its debut on AMC this Sunday, February 23rd, and I thought maybe this would be a good opportunity to catch up on Season 4, because Season 5 promises to be huge, much more eventful and monumental than seasons past. This is, after all, the next to last season. It's the season in which he finally takes on the name, Saul Goodman, sheds the whole Jimmy McGill shtick, goes all in. That plus Nacho's relationship with Gus and the new Salamanca Lalo, with whom Saul has a long and illustrious history, which we're only now going to learn about in this season. There's a lot of stuff cooking, and so let's figure out how we got here. And I would hope that this would be unnecessary, but let's just get this out of the way up front. Spoiler alerts ahead. This is nothing but spoilers tonight. We're recapping Better Call Saul Season 4. It's all good, man. First of all, talking about the various identities of Jimmy and Saul, let's talk about his current identity in current year, these little intros that we see at the beginning of episodes, particularly season openers. His identity, as he himself predicted toward the end of Breaking Bad, where he said, "If I'm lucky, when all this is over, I end up managing a Cinnabon in Omaha." That appears to be exactly what he's doing, running a Cinnabon in Omaha under the name of Gene. He's gotten pudgy, he's got a mustache. Probably some of that is for WITSEC purposes, trying to keep safe, trying to avoid being killed. Some of it is because he's a sad and broken man. You see him sitting in front of the TV, watching his old commercials from the Better Call Saul days, remembering better times. He's broken, he's sad, but most importantly, he's paranoid. Last season opened with him having some kind of episode, one that appeared to be something akin to a heart attack or a cardiac event, certainly. And it had been leading to that for a while. We'd seen him been looking out of the corner of his eye at every tough guy who'd entered the mall. I remember at one point a guy came in picking up his girlfriend, but he was wearing a flight jacket. He had short-cut hair. He looked like he could have been in a gang. And Gene/Jimmy/Saul, that's his fate now, to live the rest of his life in fear. And that paranoia is clearly having a serious impact on his well-being. Might he die, Gene, before the series is up? I think we saw strong suggestions that that's a real possibility in Season 4. I look forward to seeing more of what's going on with Gene in Seasons 5 and 6, and I'd love it if they even maybe devoted more time. It's so cool how they do these just tiny little teasers to remind you that this is all taking place in the past, where it all led for Jimmy, Gene, Saul, and what's going on in the future. But as that future, his present, becomes more dire, as the effects it's taking on his health, and as it's very possible that the many enemies he's made really are closing in on him, maybe we could see more than these little black and white teasers, great as they are. Maybe we could see an episode in which Gene plays a real factor, in which in all these time cuts that they make, jumping back and forth, we maybe spend a segment, an act, maybe even an episode or two about Gene and his fate. Before the series wraps at Season 6, I think we ought to have something like that. See what's really going on right now with Gene, Jimmy, Saul, whatever. As for Better Call Saul proper, the show after its little intro featuring Gene freaking out, checking himself into, then out of a hospital, having a major panic attack, which again, we're going to see those increasing. We pick up right after the events of the Better Call Saul Season 3 finale, which saw the sad fate of Chuck McGill, in which he made his house as flammable as possible, lit a lantern, set himself on fire, and ended his life. And as is often the case with death, especially with self-inflicted death, it's not about the guy who died. He is now at rest, whatever that means. It's about the massive impact, the ripple effect it has on those he's left behind. And that's all over Season 4 of Better Call Saul. Hangs over Saul, Howard, Kim, and everyone. It's a shadow from which, just as in life, Jimmy can't escape. It's still all about Chuck. Chuck leaves Jimmy $5,000, which Jimmy is both insulted by and expected. It's the least you can leave a family member and not expect to have it contested legally. It's, here's the amount of money I have to give you so that you don't continue to make my life miserable, even now that it's over, so that you don't hassle my friends and colleagues and my former law firm. Take your $5,000. I'm gone. This is how little I thought of you. I wanted you to have enough to just be done from even my afterlife. It's a real insult, and it starts Jimmy down a road of great depression and lowers his already very low sense of self-worth. Jimmy is also flabbergasted at just how badly Chuck wanted to die. He took all of those electronic machines and wiring, everything that he was so terrified of touching, of having in his house, because he'd gone a little bit crazy. He thought he was allergic to magnets. He was wearing a space blanket. We all know this. They were all piled up in the backyard near where Chuck's tent was pitched, the tent in which he kicked over the lantern that set himself ablaze. And so he was determined to go out in what seems like it must have been a gruesome and painful fashion. And yet, interestingly, Howard Hamlin of Hamlin McGill, Jimmy's longtime nemesis, and for the most part Chuck's friend, but toward the end of season 3, he turned on Chuck. Chuck had become a liability and an embarrassment, and he'd forced him out of the firm. This is one of the reasons, truly, Chuck did himself in. And Howard has a moment of clarity. He takes full responsibility for this. He believes it's entirely on him that Chuck took his own life. And there's an extent to which, honestly, he's right. But really, Jimmy was a foil for Chuck forever. He made his life miserable. We see this in flashback after flashback. Chuck's relationship with his parents, with his dying mother, with his now ex-wife. Jimmy did love and care for Chuck, but the two of them were toxic to each other. And Chuck began it all by sabotaging Jimmy's hard-earned legal career. But Jimmy paid him back again and again and again, embarrassing Chuck in ridiculous ways. Whether Chuck deserved it, honestly, he probably did. Michael McKean has discussed playing Chuck and acknowledged that Chuck was a terrible person, an awful character. He played him as sympathetically as he could, but he understood he was playing kind of a piece of shit. That said, it is interesting, A, that Howard suddenly grows a real conscience, is burdened with guilt, and more interestingly, that Jimmy absolutely welcomes it. He goes, yep. Well, that's your cross to bear, buddy. I'm moving on with my life because none of this has anything to do with me. Although, again, he's internalized something very, very different. He thinks that a lot of it is his fault. And Kim Wexler, his friend and lover, is aware of the effect that all of this is having on Jimmy. The petty inheritance, the last fuck you from the grave from Chuck, the very act of suicide by Chuck, all of it. Chuck leaves a letter behind for Jimmy that he reads and does not respond to. He has deadened himself to this side of him. He has killed Chuck internally, removed him as an influence as best as he can. Kim, on the other hand, reads the letter and cries. She knows that Jimmy is putting on a brave face. She knows Jimmy's hurting and he's spiraling in self-destruction. Speaking of which, Jimmy's on a 1-year suspension from the Bar Association. He can't practice law. He needs to kill time, and he needs to earn money. So what does he do? First, he tries and gets a normal, real job. Goes to a fax machine company, gets a job as a salesman. Easily. Comes in with this great song and dance pitch. You know, Jimmy, Saul, whatever. He talks an amazing game. He's got them charmed, begging him to come work for them. And he then is disgusted by this. He goes, how do you know that what I'm saying is true? How do you know I'm not a con man? How do you know I'm not going to steal this entire company out from under you, sabotage your business? You're a bunch of idiots. I wouldn't work for you for all the money in the world. Storms out of the meeting, leaving a bunch of very confused fax machine salesmen who will be very much more confused in a few years when fax machines pretty much cease to exist. But for now, they're just like, what the hell just happened? Jimmy, of course, is naturally inclined toward the shadier side of life. That's how he got suspended in the first place. So he gets a gig managing a cell phone store, gets super bored, super fast, and comes up with a scheme to sell burners on the street, prepaid phones. He takes the $5,000 that Chuck left him, buys a ton of them, and goes around to dangerous neighborhoods trying to sell them to gangsters, drug dealers. And it's not long at all before, well, first of all, everyone thinks he's a narc and a bunch of people try and attack him. He convinces people that he's not a narc, does a little bit of decent business, but he's just out there looking like a middle-aged man. He's not looking particularly threatening. He's wearing a tracksuit, but he doesn't look like a mobster. He looks like an old dude in a tracksuit. And so it's not long before he's jumped and mugged. This is where Huell returns to the world of Better Call Saul, Breaking Bad. Huell and another mercenary find the teens, string them up, and in terrifying fashion, explain to them in no uncertain terms, don't mess with the burner phone guy. You see this guy, you give him his phones back, and you spread the word. He's off limits. Or else we take these baseball bats, take out some of your teeth, maybe a little bit of your skull. You understand what we're saying? And very quickly, Jimmy the burner phone salesman becomes untouchable. Of course, Kim finds out, and he needs to change his ways. Because let's be honest, he wants a life of some stability, and he wants love. He wants Kim. That is really his driving force up until this point of the show. Interestingly, by the way, an important footnote to this whole little burner mini saga is that as he was selling burner phones, it was important that he not use the name, "Hi, I'm Jimmy McGill selling you these illegal burner phones," because he wants to be reinstated by the bar at the end of this one-year suspension. So he sells them under the name Saul Goodman. Kim, meanwhile, speaking of, is keeping herself really busy. She's still sole counsel for Mesa Verde, this huge bank in New Mexico. But she wants to do more, and she wants to help the less fortunate. This is undoubtedly, this attraction to lost puppy dogs is how she ended up caring for Jimmy in the first place. So she starts taking on pro bono work, helping people who really need help and can't afford it. But now she's working extra hard, getting no money for her troubles, and she's basically supporting Jimmy, who's unable to sell burner phones and can barely make ends meet selling regular cell phones or doing anything for that matter. So she takes a job, and this crushes Jimmy, working at Schweikart and Coakley, law firm that's had a pretty big role in the show from season 1 and has had their eyes on Kim for some time. This devastates Jimmy. He really dreamed of the suspension ending and there being a new firm, Wexler and McGill, or McGill and Wexler. This is really a pivotal moment in what will eventually lead to him becoming Saul Goodman, the attorney, because his dream of being a lawyer alongside Kim was everything. It was his motivation. It was what was keeping him going. Now it's gone. Nacho, meanwhile, the lovable Salamanca foot soldier, the nicest guy in that crew, the guy who tried to have Mike assassinate Tuco because Tuco was just such a loose cannon and was a danger to the world, a kind of lovable, almost peaceful kind of gangster, doing what he has to do working for the Salamancas. It's not really a choice. Being as tough as he needs to be, and yeah, occasionally being a bit of a dick. Hassling that one weird, goofy drug dealer, the guy who hired Mike to be his bodyguard when he sold his first batch of drugs, the really naive, chunky guy who had this whole issue with Nacho stealing his baseball cards, stuff like that. Like a little bit of a playground bully, but in the world of Better Call Saul and the Salamancas and Gus Fring, hardly a bad guy. Almost like, if we're playing Dungeons & Dragons, neutral. Like he's doing the best he can, not being a monster about it. But things got really hot for him. At the end of season 3, Hector Salamanca said, this is all brought on, by the way, by Gus Fring and the pressure he's putting on him and the way he's becoming such a darling of Don Eladio and the cartel. Hector's greedy. He wants a better supply chain, and he tells Nacho that he's going to basically enslave his father, a guy who hates the life of crime, who believes that Nacho's reformed, whose heart it would break to know about this, and who would say no to Hector if he knew that Hector is going to demand that he take over his sewing shop, make it a distribution and manufacturing house for his meth. And in fact, that's just what he does when Nacho first comes to him and explains this. He's distraught, he's miserable, and he's rebellious. He will not comply. So he's being set up to be murdered by Hector Salamanca, and Nacho, look, he's not going to let his dad get killed. And so it's Nacho who, with the help of this wacky drug dealer who he at one point had robbed, gets these fake pills, Hector's stress tension pills, and replaces them with this homemade concoction he makes, empty capsules filled with toxins designed to hopefully, ideally, kill Hector. What ends up happening instead is Hector has the massive stroke that leaves him as the Hector we come to know later in Breaking Bad. And of course, at the end of season 4, Better Call Saul. Unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but eventually receive a bell through which he communicates. This is all the work of Nacho Varga. The Salamancas don't know it, but Gus Fring knows. He finds out, and he comes to Nacho and tells him pointedly, "You are mine." So Nacho wasn't under enough stress, right? He's just saved his father's life barely. He can't believe he got away with doing what he did to Hector Salamanca. He's got stress from every corner of his life. He's headed for an early stroke. Now he's also a double agent, working for the Salamancas and Gus Fring. And his initiation into Fring's army is horrific. Fring sends 2 of his guys after him to shoot him. Gotta make it look real. Make it look like he was attacked by Gus Fring. Set up this whole double agent situation. Poor Nacho is stitched up by the vet we've come to know from season 1, the one who Mike used early on as a sort of middleman agent to get back into mercenary crime work. And the vet goes, "Nacho, I've stitched you up, but go to a hospital because you might have a punctured bowel and that'll kill you in the most disgusting, painful way imaginable. And by the way, don't ever come and talk to me again. This cartel shit, I'm out. Goodbye. We're not likely to be seeing him in season 5, that poor vet. But perhaps he'll do what he ought to have been doing this entire time and maybe help some animals. Mike, speaking of, is now fully employed by and loyal to Gus Fring, and under Fring's instructions, he hires a crew of Germans, beginning with this very nice guy, Werner, to build the super lab, the one we come to see again in Breaking Bad. This, too, involves a flashback and a reappearance by Gail Bedecker. A lot of Breaking Bad timelines are beginning to really intersect with Better Call Saul. A lot of flashbacks, Easter eggs. We actually meet Ira. He steals a Hummel figurine for Saul at one point. This is the guy we meet later on, very late toward the end of Breaking Bad, the guy who owns Vamanos Pest. But in service of the super lab, first Werner and then a crew he imports from Germany, including a bunch of young and sort of snotty ruffian types, come to build this super lab, to pour the concrete, set up all the machinery, lay the groundwork. I mean, this is a massive secret underground construction project. It's unimaginable the amount of work, man hours, labor. Mike has to work with Gus to build basically an underground village in which they can live, because they are doing a serious project that takes months. And Werner, sadly, beloved Werner, the guy without whom none of this could have been possible, the guy who Mike really grew fond of, made a break for it. He wanted to see his wife, even though it had been made clear to him from the very beginning that there was to be no contact with the outside world during all this, that it's not been disclosed to him what the nature of the project is, but him and all of his workers need to isolate themselves. They need to stay quiet. They need to understand that their boss is someone who's very serious and will not tolerate any deviation from the rules, and the consequences of doing so will be unimaginable. But Werner loves and misses his wife, calls her, breaks out of the facility to go meet with her and have what he expects will be a couple of days vacation, catching up with his wife, without whom he is distraught, empty, a shell of a man, can't really work. Mike sympathizes and tries to explain to Werner that it's just not possible. But Werner makes a run for it, sadly ending up being chased actually both by Mike and by Lalo, the Salamanca to whom I alluded earlier, guy who's brought in very late in the season to help keep things running smoothly. Lalo, you might recall, is the name uttered by Saul in Breaking Bad episode 208, the first appearance of Saul Goodman. This is where Jesse and Walt kidnap Saul, take him out into the desert, and they're wearing ski masks. Throw him on the ground, his hands are tied behind his back, and he's having a panic attack. He goes, "Oh, no. Did Lalo send you? Please, no, I didn't do it. Siempre, no Don Lalo." And they're like, "Who the hell is Lalo? We just want you to get Badger out of jail." And he goes, oh my God, you're not from Lalo. Thank God. So Lalo and Saul have not yet met each other. Lalo and Jimmy, Lalo and Saul. But clearly season 5, there's going to be some interactions, and they're going to be hot and heavy, because that is a name that has Saul terrified. And it's when he is kidnapped, that is whom he assumes has kidnapped him. So watch for Lalo to make big waves in seasons 5 and 6 of Better Call Saul. But in this case, he's come in, just made a little bit of a name for himself, introduced himself to Nacho, made poor Nacho stress even more because now there's a new Salamanca in town. It's Lalo who gifts Hector the bell to communicate with, and Mike and Lalo are both racing to catch Werner because Lalo knows that there's something going down with Gus Fring, and he's already established that Fring is a competitor to the Salamancas, that he's a threat to them, at least within the cartel. He does not yet know what a destructive force he will be on the Salamancas and the cartel itself. He just knows that he wants him out of the picture, or at the very least to be monitored very closely so he can report back to the Salamancas. So it's a race against time. Werner trying to get to his wife and hopefully survive, but with both Mike and Lalo chasing after him. And it's Mike who catches up with him first, just barely. Lalo comes very close. And yet his fate was going to be the same either way. Mike, with a lot of regret, but with a sense of responsibility and a need to own what has to be done, he executes Werner. It's one of the saddest moments in all of Better Call Saul to date. Saul, meanwhile, Jimmy, has been chafing this entire season at doing the right thing, at least feigning regret, being changed, feeling a need to be the kind of man that Kim wants, to be the kind of man who could be reinstated by the Bar Association once his suspension is up. He is taking any opportunity he can, not to skirt the rules just for the sake of it, but because he thinks they're hypocritical, and he's not entirely wrong, but also because he's a rebellious spirit and kind of a criminal at heart. That's just who he is. One of the most revelatory things about Better Call Saul is how someone like him could end up in the world of law has a lot to do with family issues and the shadow that Chuck cast over his entire life. And that's also probably a lot of what caused him to be a scoundrel, having this perfectionist, superior intellect brother, and the effect that had on his view of the world and of himself. And even in the aftermath of Chuck's passing, Chuck has been lionized, been made a saint, and Jimmy is a scumbag selling burner phones on the street. And he's not entirely convinced that he wants to come begging and scraping for his ability to practice law to return. He knows that's what he needs to do, and he makes a pass at it. But in fact, where he fails his first go-round with the Bar Association is they give him a chance to talk about how devastated he is at Chuck's loss, how sad he is. And he really doesn't want to talk about Chuck. He's sick of being under that shadow. Chuck's dead already. He's been living with this guilt and this shame and this sense of being inferior to Chuck for his entire life, and he's done with it. However, refusing to do so, being honest, as the Bar Association ostensibly wants him to be, prevents him from getting his license back to practice law. And so with Kim's help, he has an appeal hearing, one in which he just acts his heart out. He realizes that what they want from him is not really penitence for what he's done. What they want is for him to acknowledge that Chuck is the great McGill, the McGill to which he must aspire to one day come close to being anything like as a lawyer. It's embarrassing. It is a lot of eating shit, but he's prepared to do it as essentially an acting role. So in this appeals hearing, he finally opens this letter that has been hanging over this season. The letter Chuck left him before he died. He cherry picks a few choice lines, leaves out a lot of the stuff about how disappointed Chuck had always been in him, and reads the parts in which Chuck spoke highly of him, however condescendingly they may have actually been written. He reads them to the panel, chokes up when Chuck says words to the effect of, "I hope that one day you may find the error of your ways and truly embrace the law," and he acts as if those words mean everything to him, and as if he's going to spend the rest of his days trying to live up to them, trying to live up to Chuck. And so the appeals board wholeheartedly reinstates his license. Because after all, the truth is, as Jimmy's known from day one, the way to get by for him in this world has never been to be his truest self, his best self, because the world won't accept that from him. He speaks about that a lot, very eloquently throughout the course of season 4, and he proves it when he's very honest with the Bar Association and they turn him down, and when he instead comes back, hams it up, and lies his ass off to great applause and much celebration. He is reinstated, gets his law license back, and at the very end, before he leaves the building, Kim just wants to celebrate and take him out to drinks, but he goes, no, I need a DBA. I won't be practicing under the name Jimmy McGill. After that great performance about how important the name McGill is, how important Chuck McGill has been to him, and how he prays to one day be a third of the lawyer that Chuck was, a third of the man. He wants a DBA because from here on out, he will not be practicing under the name Jimmy McGill. Kim looks at him and goes, "Huh? What are you talking about?" And Jimmy utters the phrase, "Saul Goodman," setting up season 5, the name change of Saul Goodman. And if you checked out the sneak preview to the first episode of season 5 of Better Call Saul, there's a link to it in the description for last night's podcast. You will see that he talks about Saul Goodman being a great name for a lawyer because after all, that was the name he used to sell burner phones with. So all the guys who got scooped up and arrested using those burner phones, why, they can just call their old buddy Saul Goodman who sold them to him in the first place and he can defend them. He's already starting down the road, just with episode 1 of season 5, of becoming not a criminal attorney, but as Jesse Pinkman said, a criminal attorney. AMC also put together a video recapping season 4 Better Call Saul. I'll link to that in tonight's podcast episode. And again, Better Call Saul season 5 premieres Sunday, February 23rd on AMC. In the meantime, I'd love it if you got in touch with me. You can email matt@mattsager.com or call me and leave me voice messages at 646-535-4788. You can also get me on social media, where on Twitter I'm @MattSager, Instagram MattSagerVO, and on Facebook you can connect with this podcast at facebook.com/MattSagerPodcast. I'm also a voice actor, so you can check out my voice acting page at facebook.com/MattSagerVO. I'll also have links in tonight's podcast description for my Patreon, if you'd like to support the show. You can also support it via this podcast's host at Anchor.fm. I'll attach a link to that as well, along with an Anchor.fm page where you can leave voice messages, which, if you'd like to be a part of this podcast, leave me voice messages, and I'll be happy to play them as long as you don't just curse me out or say horrible racial stuff or something like that. As for everything else Matt Sager related, there's a ton of it. There's articles and blog posts that I've written, more social media handles, profiles, and links. Very importantly, those voiceover reels and contact information if you'd like to hire me, and tons more, including an archive of all the episodes of this podcast to date, and even more than that. You can find it all at my website, mattsagervoiceover.com.